In 1519, 400 Spaniards arrived in what is now Mexico. By 1521, the mighty Aztec Empire was no more. In just 2 years, this small group of Europeans had defeated one of the largest empires in history, and it wasn't even close. The Aztecs were utterly humiliated. Their warriors were no match for the Spaniards, who were armed with guns, horses, and steel armor. To make matters worse, many of the Aztecs' allies abandoned them when the Spaniards started making deep inroads into the empire. And perhaps most shocking of all, the Spaniards were able to defeat the Aztecs with only around 500 men at their peak. Thanks to superior technology, ruthless tactics, and a bit of luck, the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs is one of the greatest what-if moments in history. What if the roles were reversed? Would an Aztec force of 500 elite warriors be able to conquer Spain? Probably not. But why did the Aztec Empire fall so easily to a few strangers? Let's find out. Welcome to our channel, where we bring you the craziest and weirdest facts from human history. Some of the stuff we find is so wild that you won't learn it anywhere else. And today is no exception. If you like stories about ancient civilizations, then you'll love this video. We'll be looking at some crazy details about the fall of the Aztecs. So sit back, relax, and get ready to learn. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an upload. When the Spaniards first arrived in the Aztec Empire, they were actually mistaken for gods. Montezuma II, the Aztec emperor at the time, thought that Cortez was the god Quetzalcoatl, who had been promised by prophecy to return from the east. This is because the Aztecs had been expecting the return of Quetzalcoatl for centuries, and Cortez and his men fit the description perfectly. They were bearded, fair-skinned men with blue eyes, which the Aztecs associated with the color of the sky. Also, the Aztecs believed that Quetzalcoatl would bring with him great treasures from the east, and when Cortez and his men arrived with horses and guns, the Aztecs assumed that they were the god and his followers. Of course, this couldn't be further from the truth, but the Aztecs' belief in the prophecy played right into Cortez's hands. He was able to use their belief in Quetzalcoatl to gain the trust of the Aztec nobility, and eventually take control of the empire. Aztec society was very stratified, with a small group of nobles at the top, followed by merchants, artisans, and commoners. At the bottom were the slaves. The Spaniards were able to take advantage of this social hierarchy to their benefit. They allied themselves with the nobles and used their support to subjugate the rest of the empire. For example, when Cortez and his men arrived in the Aztec Empire, they were received by a local chief named Moctezuma. Cortez and his men stayed in Moctezuma's city for several months, and during that time, they made many inroads into the city's social elite. When it came time for Cortez to leave, he left most of his men behind in the city under the guise of continuing to explore the empire. However, in reality, he was taking advantage of the city's social hierarchy to gather allies against the Aztecs. He knew that the merchants and nobles would be eager to side with him against the ruler, and he was able to secure their support relatively easily. With the help of his new allies, Cortez was able to overthrow the ruler and take control of the city. From there, he began to march on other cities in the Aztec Empire, and he was able to take them down one by one with relative ease. Though the Aztecs had a large army, they weren't very good fighters. The reason for this is that the Aztecs' military was primarily made up of foot soldiers. They didn't have any cavalry, and they didn't really know how to use guns effectively. In addition, the Aztecs' military was very decentralized. There wasn't a standing army that was loyal to the central government. Instead, the military was made up of soldiers who were loyal to the local rulers. When the Spaniards attacked, the Aztecs were simply no match for them. The Spaniards were able to defeat the Aztecs in battle after battle, and it didn't take long for the rest of the empire to fall. As we already mentioned, the Aztec Empire was huge, but it wasn't united. In fact, the Aztec Empire was made up of hundreds of different city-states, each of which was ruled by a local king or queen. Now, these rulers were technically vassals of the central government, but they were still pretty much independent. They were allowed to keep most of the wealth they collected within their city-state, and they were only required to give the central government a small portion of their annual tribute. As you can imagine, this led to a lot of tension within the empire. The rulers of the various city-states were often at war with each other, and the central government was always having to mediate disputes. This lack of unity made it very easy for Cortez and his men to conquer the empire. All he had to do was convince a few of the local rulers to side with him, and the rest of the empire soon fell like dominoes. The Spaniards were also aided by the fact that the Aztecs were suffering from a severe case of smallpox. Smallpox is a deadly disease that is caused by a virus. It's incredibly contagious and has a mortality rate of around 30%. When the Spaniards arrived in the Americas, they brought with them a virus that had never before set foot on the continent. Smallpox spread like wildfire among the native populations, and the Aztecs were no exception. In fact, it's believed that as many as 20 million Aztecs died from smallpox, and that was out of a total population of only around 30 million. This obviously weakened the empire greatly and allowed the Spaniards to conquer it with relative ease. When Cortés and his men arrived in the Aztec Empire, they had no idea that they were walking into a disaster. They had heard rumors that there was a powerful empire in the east, but they had no idea just how powerful it was. They also had no idea that they were about to face an army that was many times larger than their own. Despite being outnumbered, Cortés and his men were able to win every battle they fought. The Aztecs simply couldn't believe that these strange bearded men could defeat them in battle. After seeing their gods return, the Aztecs were hesitant to fight the Spaniards. They believed that doing so would be a sin. This hesitancy gave the Spaniards the upper hand in every battle. They were able to defeat the Aztecs without suffering heavy casualties. The Aztecs, on the other hand, suffered heavy casualties. In fact, it's estimated that as many as 20,000 Aztecs were killed in the battles with the Spaniards. That's around 100 times the number of Spaniards killed. One of the main reasons the Spaniards were able to defeat the Aztecs was because they had access to better weapons. The Spaniards had guns, steel armor, and horses. The Aztecs, on the other hand, didn't have any guns. Their armor was made out of cotton, wood, and leather, and they didn't have any cavalry. This disparity in technology gave the Spaniards a huge advantage in battle. The Aztecs simply couldn't compete with the Spaniards' guns and armor. They were easily defeated in hand-to-hand combat as well. The Spaniards were much stronger and more agile than the Aztecs. They were also more disciplined and better trained. This is not to say that the Aztecs were bad fighters. In fact, they were quite fierce and courageous. But the Spaniards were just too much for them. Another factor that contributed to the fall of the Aztec Empire was the Spaniards' ruthlessness. The Spaniards were willing to do whatever it took to defeat the Aztecs. They didn't take prisoners, and they showed no mercy. The Aztecs, on the other hand, were more merciful. They believed in giving their enemies a chance to surrender. This leniency ultimately cost them the war. Finally, the Spaniards were also aided by luck. For example, when Cortés and his men first arrived in the Aztec Empire, they were attacked by a local tribe. The Spaniards were outnumbered, but they managed to defeat the tribe and capture its leader. This victory gave the Spaniards a huge boost, and it made it clear to the Aztecs that these were no ordinary men. The Spaniards also benefited from a number of lucky breaks throughout the war. For example, the Aztecs' belief in the prophecy that foretold the return of Quetzalcoatl gave the Spaniards a major advantage. If the Aztecs hadn't believed the prophecy, they may have been more suspicious of Cortés and his men. The Spaniards were also aided by the fact that the Aztecs were suffering from a severe drought. This made the Aztecs more desperate for help and more willing to listen to what the Spaniards had to say. The fall of the Aztec Empire is a classic example of how superior technology can overcome brute force. The Aztecs may have had a large army, but it wasn't enough to defeat the Spaniards. The Spaniards' guns, steel armor, and horses proved to be too much for the Aztecs to handle. The fall of the Aztec Empire is also a lesson in the importance of unity. If the Aztec rulers had been able to put aside their differences and unite against the Spaniards, they may have been able to defeat them. But as it was, the Spaniards were able to take advantage of the divisions within the empire and conquer it with relative ease. So what do you think? Do you think the Aztecs could have defeated the Spaniards if they had put aside their differences and united? Or was the Aztec Empire doomed to fall as soon as the Spaniards arrived? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching.